Hey guys, it's Mrs. Yagle again, and I'm here to read chapter 15 of Addison Cooke and the Tomb of the Khan. This chapter starts on page 151, and we're picking up just as soon as they found Sir Frederick's sword. That's where chapter 14 left off. So chapter 15, of course, is called The Crusader's Sword. Addison passed his flashlight back to Molly. He clasped the hilt of the Crusader's long sword in both hands and hefted it out of the coffin. The blade flickered and gleamed in the light. "High-carbon steel," said Raj, his eyes wide in the darkness. "The twin fullers add strength to the blade." The two-handed grip was nearly a foot long to the tang, and the blade was another 4 feet on top of that. All told, the heavy sword was nearly as tall as Addison. He set it down on the ground to examine it carefully under Molly's light. The front was unadorned, so he turned the sword over on its back. He spotted a few stanzas of Old French carved into the withered leather hilt. "The next clue," he grinned. Madame Feng's voice grew suddenly louder as she turned a corner in the maze, her stiletto heels clicking closer down the rocky tunnels. Addison had lost enough relics in his day to make a habit of copying down clues as soon as he found them. He flipped to a blank page in his notebook, set a pencil on its flat edge, and traced a rubbing of the clue. "Faster, they're almost here," Molly whispered. The triad seemed to be closing in from 2 directions. Addison realized they were already out of time. "Everybody get inside a casket!" Raj wasted no time in prying the lid off a fresh coffin. It was as if he'd been waiting his whole life for someone to order him inside a casket. He shoved aside a dusty skeleton and dove in next to it. Addison heaved the long sword back inside its empty coffin and climbed in after it, Molly squeezing in beside him. They were used to sharing a bunk bed, and Molly figured a casket wouldn't be too big a transition. Only Eddie balked. He stood in the passageway, hopping from foot to foot. Addison maneuvered his coffin lid shut. "Eddie, stop messing around." "I'm not getting in a casket with a skeleton." "Get in the casket or you'll be a skeleton." Madame Feng's trilling laugh grew louder down the stone passageway. Eddie scrambled into Raj's coffin head first. "This is the worst summer vacation of my life," he hissed before Raj slid their coffin lid closed. Addison lay still in his coffin, controlling his breathing and hoping Molly wouldn't sneeze from the dust. His Aunt Delia had often warned him that his antics would put him in an early grave, but this was all happening much sooner than he'd expected. Through knotholes in the wood, he followed the conversation in the passageway. "There it is!" Madame Feng's voice rang in the stone chamber. "The all-seeing Templar eye scratched into the rock. I must thank whoever left this fishing line. I might never have found this clue on my own." Inside his coffin, Addison received a sharp elbow in the ribs from Molly. He grimaced. "The next clue must be here somewhere," Madame Feng continued. Addison perked up at the sound of his Uncle Nigel's voice. "The all-seeing Templar eye is a deception. The Templars are trying to trick you." Addison knew his uncle was a mediocre liar at best, but he was better than Aunt Delia. "It might not be the all-seeing eye at all," she offered. "It might just be ancient graffiti." "Nonsense," said Madame Feng. "The eye is staring directly at that coffin." She called to 2 of her triad bodyguards. "Who and when? Open that casket." Addison heard a few hesitant shuffling steps, followed by an angry screech from Madame Feng. "Don't be superstitious cowards! Open the coffin and look inside." It was at this point that Addison began to question his wisdom in hiding inside the very coffin Madame Feng was searching for. He heard heavy boots trudge close. Rough hands seized the wooden lid. Even in the darkness, Addison could see Molly's eyes darting back and forth in a panic. He thought about mentioning the fact that this was a sticky wicket, but thought better of it. His mind raced. He vaguely remembered Sun Tzu saying something pithy about the element of surprise. He decided to give it a whirl. The coffin lid jerked open and several faces appeared over the rim, Madame Feng and 2 gang members. Addison leapt up, screaming and waving his hands demonically. The 2 gang members sprang backward in horror. Even the cold-blooded Madame Feng was momentarily frozen in shock. Addison jumped out of the casket and landed on the floor in a crouch. Before the gang members could recover their cool, Molly sprang from the coffin, screaming like a banshee. "Eddie! Raj! Code red, Addison shouted. Raj and Eddie burst screaming from their coffin, following Addison's example. Raj adopted more of a zombie-like moan, while Eddie's screams appeared to simply be genuine fright. Addison spun toward Aunt Delia and Uncle Nigel, who seemed to have dislocated their jaws in astonishment. Run for it! When neither moved, Addison realized that each relative was handcuffed to the wrist of a triad. Escape was impossible. Madame Fang, recovering her wits, yowled with anger. Catch those brats! The triads, still jittery from their shock, swung their fists at Addison and Molly, but Aunt Delia and Uncle Nigel yanked their handcuffs backwards, stalling each punch. Hearing the commotion, more triads thundered down the tunnels, closing in. Addison! Molly, get out of here! Aunt Delia called. We're not leaving without you, said Addison. It's too dangerous for you. Addison ducked a wild haymaker from the triad handcuffed to Uncle Nigel. Addison Herbert Cooke, I order you to leave! Aunt Delia shouted. Her stern voice had an instant effect on Addison, who knew better than to cross his aunt when her blood was up. He hauled the heavy sword from the coffin. Give us a hand, Mo! Molly took the sword, almost tipping over from its weight. Addison dodged a leaping triad and scooped up the fishing line. Run! He shouted to his friends. He took off sprinting without looking back. He hurtled down a long passage, scooping up thread hand over hand and trying not to trip on it. He knew if he gathered all of the thread, Madame Fang would lose time finding her way back out of the labyrinth. He banged a left and another left, shrinking tunnels signaling the edge of the maze. Addison could hear his compatriots galloping after them. Almost there! He turned the next corner and slammed straight into a triad. Addison sprawled on the hard stone floor. The triad held the other end of the thread in the air and smiled. Addison looked up in shock. Tony Chin? To his surprise, Tony spoke clear English with only the faintest whiff of a Hong Kong accent. Addison Cooke, I have been waiting for you. Tony the Triad whipped out his trench knife, beckoning Addison to fight. Addison clambered to his feet. He drew his butterfly knife, flipping it open with an elaborate flourish. Tony laughed and shook his head. Eddie took a few steps backward. Addison, do you have any idea what you're doing? Of course. And thank you for that vote of confidence, Eddie. Here, hold this so I can see what I'm doing. He tossed his flashlight to Eddie, who fumbled it. Light danced around the cavern, throwing crazy carnival shadows across the walls until Eddie managed to scoop up the rolling flashlight. By the time Addison could see what was happening, Tony was right on top of him. Addison made a few panicked swipes with his knife. Tony ducked and sidestepped, effortlessly dodging Addison's blows. The triad twitched his arm and knocked the butterfly knife from Addison's hands. It clattered uselessly to the ground. Tony stood back to let Addison retrieve the knife. Addison realized he was being toyed with. Do you want help, Addison? Molly asked. In a sec, said Addison. I'm finding his weaknesses. Tony laughed again and immediately smacked the butterfly knife out of Addison's grasp. Again, he paused to let Addison pick up the knife. May I give you a tip? Okay, only if it's not a knife tip. When someone attacks you blade up, you know they've never been in a knife fight. Hold your blade down, like this, Tony demonstrated. Addison adjusted his grip. Good, said Tony. Now jab with your full arm, fast, like a cobra strike. Addison whipped his arm toward the triad, the blade singing through the air. Tony blocked the strike with a clash of steel. He smiled, pleased. That's better. Very good. Thank you, Tony, said Addison. You seem like a decent fellow. I don't suppose you'd like to let us go. I would love to, but orders are orders. I'm supposed to capture you. I hope you understand it's nothing personal. I understand completely, said Addison. No offense taken. Also, I apologize, said Tony, gesturing to Molly, but I'm going to need to take the sword. Molly barely registered his words before he was lashing at her with 2 trench knives. She retreated, attempting to parry with the massive weapon. Eddie, who was covering his eyes, was not doing a spectacular job of lighting the cavern with the flashlight. Molly could hardly see Tony's strikes in time. She was quickly backed against the rough-hewn wall of the passage. Raj sprang into action. I'll save you, Molly! He dove for Tony's knees, attempting to knock him over. Tony held strong, and Raj simply clung to the triad's legs like a tenacious koala bear. Molly dropped the sword and ducked out of the corner. She managed to drag Raj away from Tony a split second before he would have connected with a well-aimed swat. Thank you, Molly, Raj gasped. She turned to square off with Tony. She was weaponless. Use your kung fu, Addison called. Molly didn't love taking orders from Addison, but he had suggested a sensible course of action. After all, what was the point of spending the past 2 months drilling kicks and punches? She visualized herself in class, on the blue mats, calling out each move in unison with the other students. Roundhouse kick, she shouted and launched a leg at Tony. He dodged it easily. Tiger claw, she shouted louder, striking her hand at Tony's throat. He bent backward like a limbo dancer, sliding out of her reach. Dragon fist, she cried a bit desperately. She struck out with both hands, but Tony had already sidestepped. The triad was smiling. If you want my advice, you shouldn't announce each move before you do it. Sort of tips your hand. Molly gulped. He made a decent point. Addison heard more triads moving closer through the dark maze, honing in on his team. They needed to pick up the pace if they hoped to escape. He pocketed his butterfly knife and scooped up the long sword. Tony, I hope you understand. This isn't personal. The great sword was too heavy for Addison to wield. When he wound up for a home run swing at Tony, Molly and Eddie had to duck to avoid the inconvenience of having their heads lopped off. Addison swung and missed. Strike one. His momentum carried him right around in a circle. He tried for a second swing at Tony and missed that as well. Strike two. Addison didn't imagine it was possible to be worse than Molly with the sword, and yet here he was. Tony would surely have skewered him by now if he hadn't been laughing so hard. Addison's heart sank.